Autocracy encapsulates a governance structure where a single entity or a small group hold unmitigated power. This omnipotence signifies a complete dominion over civil liberties, bestowing upon the autocrat the authority to dictate their execution. Autocracies are related to monarchies and dictatorships in many ways while being fundamentally different from democracies and feudal systems. The autocrat's power is often consolidated via oppressive political tactics, influencing key societal figures, and through comprehensive control over public perception via indoctrination and propaganda. While autocracy could present a facade of democracy via legislation or hollow elections, it ultimately orbits around the preservation and demonstration of the autocrat's omnipotence. Challenges within the regime pose a significant threat to the autocrat, sparking potential for a time-honored political structure. Autocracy has long been embedded in history, dating back to ancient chiefdoms, city-states, and despotic empires. For eons, monarchy remained the apex form of autocracy until dictatorships became widespread in the 19th century. The 20th century saw the rise of totalitarian dictatorships with the emergence of fascist and communist states. Currently, authoritarian and populist dictatorships prevail as the dominant autocratic entities in a post-Soviet world. In terms of etymology, autocracy is derived from the ancient Greek words auto, meaning self, and kratos, meaning power, might. Initially, the term autocrat, known as autocrator in Greek, was used to refer to monarchs, but it was reinterpreted as an imperial title during the 7th century Byzantine Empire, resembling the Latin word imperator. This term was then adopted by medieval Russian and Serbian rulers, known as samodercics over time. It developed a negative undertone, symbolizing the oppressiveness of autocracy. Authoritarian regimes concentrate immense power in the hands of a single leader or small group, effectively creating a system with minimal accountability. To firmly establish their rule, these leaders rely on influential elite support, shaping the socio-political landscape according to their will. The extent of their direct control may fluctuate based on regional affiliations or the strength of the regime's institutions. Establishing robust institutions facilitates the extraction of state resources while also offering potential checks to exerting absolute power. Interestingly, some dictatorships, such as monarchies, place emphasis on a ruling family instead of an individual autocrat, forming alliances through royal marriages or propagating a cult of personality. This approach often serves to bolster the regime's control and legitimacy. Historically, autocratic regimes have emerged from a state of disorder or anarchy, offering the allure of security and stability. The concept of stationary bandits, coined by Mansur Olson, encapsulates the idea that autocrats, compared to anarchical bandits, might be incentivized to invest in societal improvements, thereby benefiting both themselves and their subject. Douglas North, John Joseph Wallace, and Barry R. Weingast, however, view the formation of autocratic states differently, visualizing it not as a lone endeavor, but as a collaborative venture among those with access to violence. They argue that this dominant coalition, driven by an incentive to avoid violence, induced losses, cooperates, and gives each other privileged access to resources, thereby creating a state. The probability of a state becoming autocratic appears indifferent to factors like size, military might, economic welfare, or cultural characteristics, which means there is a wide spectrum of potential autocratic states. The stability of autocratic regimes is continually threatened by various factors such as general populace dissatisfaction, political opposition, or even treachery among the ruling elites. Often, the most potent danger to autocracy comes from within the ruling echelon, which yields significant influence and participates in the enforcement of the dictator's rule usually. An autocracy's downfall is through a coup, which more often than not leads to another form of autocratic government seizing power. It is rare to find an autocracy overthrown purely through popular revolt. In fact, the internal elite support is often paramount. The probability of insurrections escalates during government reform periods. Though granting civil rights, wealth redistribution, or voluntary abdication can be implemented by the autocrat to counteract rebellion, the succession in autocracies can be executed through various processes, such as hereditary succession or appointment by the autocrat or another governmental entity. Each method poses its own pros and cons. While hereditary succession generally carries a lesser risk of overthrow due to the often young, less influential successors, The system doesn't allow vetting for competency, on the other hand. Appointed successors pose a higher threat of overthrowing the autocrat themselves, but allow some degree of selecting competent individuals. The absence of a succession plan can result in power struggles upon the autocrat's removal or death. This provides a delineation between monarchical rule, which often practices a fixed succession system such as heredity, and dictatorships, which do not. The most turbulent period of an autocratic regime is often the transition from one ruler to another. Though set orders of succession can pacify the transition period, they hinder the successor's comprehensive evaluation for capability and strength of character. This aspect, however, is eased thanks to the established bureaucracy an incoming autocrat inherits, facilitating the transition by granting immediate national control without necessitating the populace's conquest or their support. Autocracy, which envelops most non-democratic forms of government, including dictatorships, monarchies, and dominant party regimes, has been historically associated with monarchistic rule. The modern era, however, sees dictatorships as more prevalent. Autocracy often incorporates state ideologies, prevalent in governments such as ancient China's Mandate of Heaven or France's 17th century Divine Right of Kings. Such ideology can then be used by the autocrat to justify their rule, a practice common in both communist and ethno-nationalist regimes. Another way an autocrat legitimizes their rule is by citing election results, especially in autocracies where the elections are manipulated. Other autocracies may argue the necessity of their rule in providing basic needs to the population, using practical considerations to justify their reign. Totalitarian governments, a classification within autocracies, exercise direct control over citizens' lives. They discourage political or cultural pluralism, instead focusing citizens' dedication towards a single ideological vision. Examples of such governments include communist states and Nazi Germany. Authoritarian governments, however, maintain control purely through repression and controlled opposition, rather than a mandatory adherence to a state ideology, and was a common characteristic of most traditional monarchies, military dictatorships, theocracies, and dominant party states. A despotic rule is a form of absolute autocracy which exercises power without any meaningful institutions. It is most common in pre-industrial societies. Sultanism, conversely, is characterized by a ruling family directly integrating itself into the state through a cult of personality to substantiate control, often through rewarding allies and using force against enemies. In contrast to other autocracies that may hold state ideologies, these regimes typically lack a guiding ideology or legal system. However, not all autocracies restrict civil and political rights. Some may allow the limited exercise of these rights and provide moderate representation for political opponents, which differentiates them from enclosed autocracies that do not permit such blended forms of governance that merge elements of democracy and autocracy or autocracy or electoral autocracy also exists. These hybrid systems may transition from autocracies towards democracy through a semi-autocratic phase or vice versa. The interweaving of absolute authority and religious importance was perpetuated in the Akkadian Empire with Naram, sin of Akkadian Empire, with Naram Sin of Akkad standing as the inaugural king to achieve divine status, setting a trend for centuries thereafter. Similarly, ancient Egypt, in its nascent history, harbored an autocratic government system with the beginning of statism at the close of the 4th millennium BC. However, China displayed a more consistent record of autocracy since the Qin dynasty replaced its ancient feudal society in 221 BC. Surprisingly, this authoritarian style had a stronger grip in China even in its period of feudalism. The significance of benign autocratic governance to uphold order was highlighted by Confucian philosophy in early Chinese society, substantially shaping Chinese intellectual progression. Ancient Greece's city-states, along with the Etruscan civilization, bore witness to the reign of despots, who were later nostalgically reinvented as kings with genetic lineage. The Roman Republic made strides by introducing the Roman dictator elected during times of instability with absolute power. However, Julius Caesar manipulated this provision in 44 BC when he became perpetual dictator, thus marring the Republic and initiating the autocratic Roman Empire. Post-classical East Asia saw the emergence of early military dictatorships like the rule over the Goguryeo kingdom by Yeongesemun in 642, the Goryeo military regime kicking off in 1170 and the shogunate in Japan existing between the 12th and 19th centuries. Advancements took place in the 13th century when parliamentary monarchies became popular, with royalties wanting expansive bodies of advisors who stood as the kingdom's contact. European nations moved towards centralized monarchy. Moving away from feudalism in the 14th century, absolutism found stronger roots in European monarchies, while the 16th century grappled with feeble leadership and religious opposition. Lawmaking bodies were generally curated to execute the king's wishes. This was occasionally given the green light with the help of the divine right of kings, especially in England and France. The concept of dictatorship as a form of despotism took shape in the 18th century as the ideology of republicanism gained prominence. The French Revolution marked a significant turning point in this notion as revolutionaries used their fight against tyranny as justification for their action. Some original strains of dictatorship took shape in Europe, such as Bonapartism, a form of monarchism excluding feudalism, and Caesarism, which drew parallels to Julius Caesar's imperial rule. Characterizing the First and Second French empires, the 19th century saw European monarchies shift away from autocracy as power in legislatures grew. In a political climate dominated by absolute power, autocrats implemented a totalitarian form of governance through a widespread party that purportedly represented the citizens. Even post-World War II, when most European dictatorships were disbanded, communism bloomed further, setting the stage for several dictatorships in the eastern parts of Europe. As time progressed into the late 20th century, these communist states became the ideal example for autocratic regimes, which were even emulated by non-communist dictatorships. Dwindling autocracy in Western Europe influenced other global regimes via colonization. Regions with historical roots in strong autocratic governance could either resist European colonization or remained unaltered, thereby conserving their autocratic nature. Societies lacking a state structure were easily colonized by European nations, leading to the subsequent adoption of democracy and parliamentary governance, mirroring trends in Europe. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 noticeably diminished the influence of autocracy in global politics. However, its significance rose again in the following decades due to the growing power of countries like China, Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. The disintegration of totalitarian regimes gave rise to authoritarian governments, shaping the 21st century political landscape. Political repression served as the primary strategy for autocrats seeking to protect their regime and retain their grip on power. These repressions could either be insidious, subtly subduing potential opposition, or direct. Involving explicit violence, autocrats would also employ co-optation by granting privileges to influential individuals in exchange for their loyalty. Furthermore, these establishments would often use political parties as tools for controlling government members, recruiting new ones, and thwarting possible military rebellions. Public control was further solidified through an effective mix of indoctrination and propaganda, resulting in autocrats garnering comparable public support to that of democratic governments. Autocrats would commonly cater to specific political, ethnic, or religious movements to win over the public's favor. Autocratic governments exhibit a broad range of foreign policies, influenced heavily by their respective forms of governance. In general, autocracies have displayed a higher propensity for war compared to democracies, as their citizens are not part of the decision-making process after consolidating power. Totalitarian autocracies have historically courted militarism and expansionism, particularly those under fascist control. This strategy enables such autocracies to propagate their state ideologies, while the existence of international enemies serves as a pretext for rallying domestic support. Autocratic regimes, often centered around the unilateral creation of a constitution to solidify power, have been a focal point of political theory since ancient Greece. Despite its historical significance, autocracy lacks the wide recognition that democracy enjoys as a distinct political theory, primarily due to its potential for corruption, violence, inefficiency, and opacity. Autocracy is frequently viewed as less favorable than democracy. Records of autocratic governments, particularly in post-colonial Africa, have been scarce, creating obstacles in comprehensive research. The comparative rarity of data concerning public support for autocracy versus democracy has likewise limited research, particularly outside of East Asia. Thankfully, evidence collection on autocratic systems has enhanced in the 21st century, enabling more thorough analysis. Long-lasting effects of autocratic rule on a nation's politics are evident even after democratization, with persistent disparities in public attitudes, policy preferences, and political engagement within the same country. For instance, post-communist countries often exhibit higher levels of government distrust and free market skepticism, impeding long-term economic progress. Xenophobia prevalence and voter inclination towards extreme political parties are also typical in former autocratic nations. Numerous democracy indices such as the Polity Data Series, the Freedom in the World Report, and the varieties of democracy indices have been developed to evaluate and categorize governments as democratic or autocratic. They assess various criteria such as franchise, freedom of speech and information, separation of powers, and election fairness, all of which are subjectively defined by each index. Despite potential discrepancies, these indices often yield similar findings, with the most variations arising from the examination of autocratic governments that incorporate both democratic elements. In the decade of 2010, autocracy promotion emerged as a significant concept in the realm of autocratic studies. This notion implies that certain governments aim to instill autocratic governance in other countries. Later investigations, however, suggest that these attempts aren't as pervasive or triumphant as initially believed, dispelling notions of a widespread rise of autocratic influence.